The laughter started as a low rumble and swelled until it was the only sound under the punishing sun of Redemption Gap. It was a cruel, rolling wave of noise, and the man at its center stood unmoving, his shoulders set against it. He was a drifter, plain as dust, with a face mapped by hard miles and eyes that held back more than they showed. His name was Finn, though no one in town knew it or cared to ask. Before him, in the center of the auction pen, stood the reason for the mockery, a horse so impossibly large it looked like a creature from a tall tale. It was a draft cross, a monster of black muscle and bone, with a scarred hide and an eye that burned with wild defiance. The auctioneer, a fleshy man named Barlow, had been trying to sell the beast for an hour. No rancher wanted a horse that ate as much as 3 regular mounts and possessed a temperament fouler than a cornered badger. It had already kicked through 2 fence posts. "He's a killer, is what he is," someone shouted from the crowd, and the laughter renewed itself. Finn watched the horse. He saw past the fear and the fury. He saw the tremor in its powerful legs, the way its ears twitched not with aggression, but with overwhelming terror. The animal was a fortress built on a foundation of pain. Barlow wiped sweat from his brow. All right. A joke's a joke. $5 to the glue factory, anyone?" The crowd chuckled, the sound mean-spirited. Finn's hand went up. A slight, almost imperceptible motion. His voice was quiet, but it cut through the noise. $7. Barlow squinted, disbelieving. "Son, you got $7. Finn didn't answer. He simply reached into his worn coat and pulled out a small, tied-off leather pouch. He untied it and poured the contents into his palm. A collection of coins, dull and varied. He counted them slowly, deliberately. $7.42. His entire worldly wealth. The laughter died, replaced by a confused, pitying silence. A man spending his last coin on a useless, dangerous beast was a spectacle of a different kind. It wasn't funny anymore. It was just sad. "Sold," Barlow said, banging his gavel with a thud of finality, eager to be done with the whole affair. To the fool with more coin than sense, Finn ignored him. He ignored the staring eyes of the townsfolk and the whispers that followed him like burrs. He walked to the gate of the pen, his movements measured and calm. He didn't carry a rope or a whip. He just opened the gate and stood there, his hands loose at his sides. The great horse snorted, a sound like a furnace blast, and stomped a hoof that shook the ground. It stared him down, a mountain of rage ready to crush the small man who dared approach. Finn did not move. He just waited. The sun beat down, baking the dust. The world held its breath. Then, slowly, carefully, he spoke to the animal, his voice too low for anyone else to hear. It was a murmur, a current of sound beneath the heat. The horse's ears swiveled, catching the tone. It took a hesitant step forward. The town watched, baffled, as the drifter and the monster stood face to face, locked in a silent conversation no one else could understand. He wasn't breaking a horse. He was making a promise. He led the horse out of town with nothing more than a hand resting gently on its powerful neck. He didn't try to saddle it, didn't even try to put a halter on it. He simply walked, and the giant animal, which men had feared to approach with 10-foot poles, followed him like a shadow. He named him Bastion. They made camp in a small, sheltered meadow a mile from the town limits, where a creek trickled over smooth stones. For the first 2 days, Finn did nothing but sit. He sat by the fire he built, mending his worn shirt with a small needle and thread he kept in his pack. He sat by the creek, watching the water flow. And all the while, Bastion watched him. The horse kept its distance, a solid shape of black against the green grass, grazing warily. It had never known a human who demanded nothing. There was no brandished rope, no shouted command, no sharp spur. There was only the quiet man and the crackle of his small fire. On the 3rd day, a visitor arrived. Her name was Lena, the blacksmith's daughter. She was tall and carried herself with the straight-spined confidence of someone who knew the weight and measure of hot iron. She had seen the spectacle at the auction and her curiosity had gotten the better of her. She found Finn not by the fire, but standing near the great horse, running a hand over a long, ugly scar on its flank. Bastien stood perfectly still, his head low, his eyes half closed. It was a picture of impossible trust. Lena stopped at the edge of the clearing, not wanting to intrude. She watched Finn's hands. They were calloused and marked with old burns and faint white lines, but they moved with a surgeon's precision and a lover's care. They were not the hands of a simple drifter. They were the hands of a man who understood how things were made, and how they could be unmade. "He seems to like you," she said, her voice clear and direct. Finn didn't startle. He had likely heard her approach long before she spoke. He gave Bastien a final, reassuring pat before turning. "His learning that a man's hand doesn't always mean pain. The whole town thinks you're a madman," she stated, not unkindly. It was a simple fact. "Maybe I am," Finn replied, his gaze steady. "But I'm not a fool. And neither is he." He gestured to the horse. He was just defending himself. The only way he knew how Lena looked from the man to the horse. She saw the quiet understanding that flowed between them, a language of shared wounds. She'd seen men try to conquer animals, to break their spirit and bend them to their will. She had never seen a man try to heal one. In his saddle pack, she saw the corner of a small, leather-bound book, its cover worn smooth with use. It wasn't the kind of thing a typical cowhand carried. She also carried something, a small sack with a fresh loaf of bread from her father's oven and a piece of hard cheese. She set it down on a flat rock between them. "A horse that big needs a lot of feed," she said. "A man does too." Finn looked at the offering, then at her. A flicker of something, surprise, gratitude, passed through his guarded eyes before being locked away again. "I thank you." "Don't thank me," Lena said, turning to leave. "Just prove them wrong." She walked away, but the image of his hands on that horse stayed with her, a puzzle she felt a growing need to solve. The proving came sooner than anyone expected. It arrived with the screech of splintering wood and the terrified screams of a child. A heavy freight wagon, loaded with milled lumber from the north, had lost a wheel at the top of the town's main street, which sloped steeply down towards the creek. The teamster was thrown clear, but his young son was still on the buckboard. The two draft horses, panicked and untethered from their driver's control, bolted. The wagon careened down the hill, a runaway engine of destruction, gaining speed with every rotation of its remaining wheels. People scattered, shouting in helpless alarm. The wagon was headed directly for the town's small mercantile, where a group of women and children stood frozen in its path. It was a disaster unfolding in slow, terrible seconds. At that exact moment, Finn was leading Bastien down the street toward the blacksmith's shop, intending to thank Lena properly and perhaps inquire about any odd jobs. He carried a small, intricately knotted rope toy he'd made for her younger brother. He saw the chaos erupt at the top of the hill. He didn't hesitate. There was no time for a plan, only for action. "Bastien! Hup!" The command was sharp, low, and urgent. The giant horse responded instantly, not with panic, but with focused power. Finn vaulted onto its broad, bare back, a fluid motion that spoke of years of practice. He had no saddle, no bridle, only two fistfuls of coarse black manet. He leaned forward, urging the horse into a gallop. The ground shuddered under Bastien's massive hooves. The crowd, which had been fleeing the wagon, now stopped to stare at the new, even more unbelievable sight, the drifter and his monster horse charging directly into the path of the runaway freight. They weren't running from the danger. They were running to meet it. Bastien's speed was terrifying. He was not built like a racehorse, but his long, powerful legs devoured the ground. Finn guided him with shifts in his weight and pressure from his knees, an incredible display of horsemanship that left the onlookers breathless. They drew alongside the careening wagon. Finn could see the boy's white, terrified face. He angled Bastien in, a dangerous, precise maneuver. The giant horse slammed his shoulder into the side of one of the panicked draft horses, knocking it off its stride. It was a move of immense power and perfect control. Bastien pushed, straining, his muscles bunched like boulders under his hide, forcing the team sideways. Finn reached out, his arms straining, and grabbed the harness of the lead horse. He pulled, adding his own strength to Bastian's, his voice a low, calming rumble that somehow cut through the noise. The wagon slewed sideways, its wheels screeching. It hit a watering trough and crashed to a halt, lumber spilling across the street just feet from the mercantile's porch. Silence descended, thick and dusty. The boy on the buckboard was crying, but he was safe. The crowd stood in stunned disbelief. The man they had mocked, the man they had pitted as a fool, had just ridden a beast they'd called a killer straight into the jaws of death to save one of their own. Finn slid off Bastian's back, his legs trembling slightly from the effort. He went to the boy, lifting him down from the wreckage. He was just a man again, covered in dust, his breathing heavy. But the town of Redemption Gap no longer saw a fool. They saw a hero. And they saw the horse, Bastian, standing calmly beside him, nickering softly, a titan of quiet strength. The laughter was gone. In its place was a new and profound respect. The town's gratitude was immediate and practical. The mercantile owner offered Finn a month's worth of supplies. The stable master gave him free board for Bastian, looking at the horse now with awe instead of fear. But it was Sheriff Miller who sought him out with a different kind of interest. Miller was an old man, his back stooped from years in the saddle, but his eyes were as sharp as they'd ever been. He found Finn in the stable, brushing down Bastian's massive flank. The sheriff didn't waste time with pleasantries. He nodded towards the horse. "That was some piece of riding yesterday. The horse did the work," Finn said, not looking up from his task. "A horse is a tool. It's the hand that wields it that matters," Miller countered. He walked closer, his gaze fixed on Bastian's left hip. There, faint beneath the black hair, was a brand. It wasn't the sprawling, ornate design of a local ranch. It was a simple, stark symbol, a shield with a single, vertical line through its center. The sheriff's eyes narrowed. He'd seen that brand only once before, a long time ago, on a government transport carrying remounts for a special federal unit back east. They were known for their heavy cavalry, for training horses to be steady in the face of chaos, to use their weight and power as weapons. They were animals bred and trained for war, not for pulling plows. "That's a Marshal's Service brand," Miller said, his voice quiet but firm. It wasn't a question. Finn's hand stilled on the brush. He remained silent for a long moment, the air in the stable thick with the scent of hay and unspoken truths. He finally turned to face the sheriff, his expression unreadable. "It's just a brand. Men don't just happen upon horses like that," Miller pressed gently. "And drifters don't ride like you do. You moved with that animal like you were one soul. That kind of partnership isn't learned on a trail drive. It's taught. Drilled." For a purpose he was laying the pieces out, inviting Finn to claim them. He was offering him a way to shed the skin of the nameless drifter. Finn looked away, his gaze settling on the worn leather of his saddlebags. Inside one, wrapped in oilcloth, was an object he hadn't looked at in 2 years. A heavy, star-shaped piece of silver. A legacy of a life he had failed and fled. "The horse has a past." "So do I," Finn said, his voice flat. "I'd prefer to leave them both where they lie." Sheriff Miller held his gaze, a long, assessing look. He saw the wall Finn had built around himself, and he recognized it for what it was, not malice, but deep, abiding pain. He knew pushing further would only make the wall higher. "All right, son," he said, nodding slowly. "But the past has a way of catching up. Especially out here." He turned and left Finn alone with his horse and his secrets. But the seed of suspicion had been planted. Finn was no ordinary man. The shield brand on Bastian was a mark of hidden competence, a symbol of a life lived with purpose and discipline. And for the first time, Finn felt a cold dread that the quiet life he sought in Redemption Gap was already slipping through his fingers. The past was not a distant country, it was a shadow that had followed him all the way here. That shadow took form a week later. They rode into town at high noon, 5 of them, their horses moving with an unnerving, synchronized gait. They were not dusty cowboys or rowdy outlaws. They were dressed in dark, practical clothing, their gear meticulously maintained. They moved with the cold efficiency of soldiers, their eyes sweeping the street, assessing angles, noting exits. The man in the lead was tall and lean, with a face that looked as if it were carved from pale granite. His name was Corcoran. He didn't have the swagger of a common bandit, he had the chilling stillness of a predator. As they dismounted in front of the saloon, the town fell quiet. Shopkeepers paused in their doorways. The usual midday chatter ceased. This was a different kind of trouble, one that felt calculated and patient. Finn was across the street, helping Samuel, Lena's father, reset a bent axle outside the smithy. The clang of the hammer on hot iron stopped. Finn looked up, and his blood ran cold. He recognized the man instantly. The face was etched into his memory, a constant presence in his nightmares. Corcoran's gaze swept the street and landed on Finn. There was no shock or surprise in his eyes, only a flicker of dark amusement, a faint, cruel smile touching his lips. It was the look of a hunter who had finally cornered his long-lost prey. The world narrowed to the space between the two men. Samuel felt the tension in Finn's shoulders, saw the blood drain from his face. "Finn? You know that man?" Finn's hands clenched into fists at his sides, the knuckles white. He didn't answer. He couldn't. The past the sheriff had warned him about was no longer catching up. It had arrived. Corcoran gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod in Finn's direction, a gesture of ownership, of a shared and violent history. Then he turned and led his men into the saloon as if he owned the town. The doors swung shut behind them, leaving a void of silence in their wake. Lena came out of the smithy, wiping her hands on a rag. She saw the look on Finn's face, a mixture of raw fear and something harder, something like resolved fury. "Who is he?" she asked, her voice low. "He's the reason I came here," Finn said, his voice raspy. "And he'll be the reason I have to leave," but as he said it, he looked over toward the stable where Bastien stood, and a different thought took root. He had run once. He had spent 2 years running, shedding his name, his duty, his very self, to escape this man. But he wasn't just a drifter anymore. He had a connection here, however fragile. He had a horse that trusted him. He had the respect of a town that had first scorned him. Running now felt like a deeper betrayal than the one he was already fleeing from. Corcoran and his men didn't make a move. They drank quietly in the saloon, their presence a suffocating weight on the town. They were waiting. And Corcoran, Finn knew, was a master of the waiting game. He was enjoying this. He wasn't just here to rob the bank. He was here to dismantle a life. He was here for Finn. That evening, as twilight bled purple and orange across the sky, Lena found Finn in the stable. He wasn't grooming Bastien or mending tack. He was sitting on a hay bale, staring at his hands as if he'd never seen them before. The confident horseman who had charged down a runaway wagon was gone. In his place was a man hollowed out by ghosts. Lena had spent the afternoon mending his saddlebags, a task she'd offered to do as an excuse to be near, to understand. Deep in a side pocket, her fingers had brushed against something hard and metallic, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth. Her curiosity, sharpened by the day's events, overcame her politeness. She had unwrapped it. It was a badge. A 5-point star, heavy and tarnished with disuse, its silver face bearing the inscription, U.S. Marshal. She held it out to him now, its dull gleam catching the faint light from the stable lantern. "Sheriff Miller was right," she said softly. "This is your past, isn't it?" Finn looked at the badge in her palm. He didn't seem surprised she had found it. He looked defeated, as if the last of his defenses had finally crumbled. He took it from her, the weight of it familiar and sickening in his hand. "It was," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "It was my life," he finally told her. The words came out in a torrent, a confession held back for 2 long years. He and his partner had been part of a special unit tasked with hunting the most dangerous, organized gangs. Corcoran's crew was their target. They were smarter, more disciplined, and more ruthless than any outlaws they'd ever faced. They had tracked them for months, across 3 territories. We had them cornered in a box canyon up in the Black Hills, Finn recounted, his eyes distant, seeing a scene only he could see. We thought we had every escape route covered. But Corcoran, he's a strategist. He anticipated our every move. He'd laid a trap within our trap, the rock slide, deliberately set. Finn's partner, a young man named Marcus, had been caught beneath it. Finn had been just feet away, helpless to do anything but watch his friend die. Corcoran and his men had ridden away, not even bothering to fire a shot. They had won with intellect and cruelty. It was my plan, Finn choked out, the shame of it raw in his voice. I was the lead marshal. Marcus trusted me. I led him into that canyon. I got him killed. He had resigned his commission the next day. He couldn't bear the weight of the badge, the symbol of a duty he had so catastrophically failed. He left everything behind, taking only his horse, a younger, less scarred Bastion, and the crushing guilt. He had been running ever since, seeking a place quiet enough to drown out the memory of the falling rocks. You didn't kill him, Finn, Lena said, her voice firm but gentle. She sat beside him on the hay, her presence a small, warm anchor in his storm of grief. Corcoran did. It doesn't matter, he said, shaking his head. I failed. I ran. A marshal doesn't run. He looked from the badge to Bastion, who stood nearby, watching them with intelligent eyes. He's the only one who knows the whole story. He was there. Lena reached out and placed her hand over his, her calloused fingers covering the tarnished star. Her touch was not one of pity, but of strength. You've been carrying this long enough, she said. Corcoran isn't just here for the bank, is he? He's here to finish what he started. To break you completely. Finn finally looked at her, his eyes clearing with a new, terrible certainty. Yes, then you can't run, she said simply. Not again. This town, these people, we see who you are now. It's time you saw it too. The forge glow of the lantern cast long shadows. In that quiet moment, the drifter died, and the marshal, however broken, began to stir. The choice was no longer about escaping the past. It was about facing it, right here, in Redemption Gap. The next day dawned heavy and grey, the air thick with unspoken tension. A storm was brewing in the distant mountains, mirroring the one about to break in the town. Corcoran and his men remained in the saloon, their presence a silent declaration of control. But the town was no longer passive. The fear was still there, but it was now mixed with a quiet resolve. The story of the runaway wagon had been retold a dozen times. The man who had saved the child was one of them now, whether he knew it or not. Sheriff Miller, Samuel, and a handful of other townsmen met with Finn in the back of the smithy. The air smelled of coal smoke and hot metal. They'll make their move on the bank, Miller said, his voice grim. Likely when the storm hits. They'll use the noise and confusion as cover. There are 5 of them, Samuel added, his blacksmith's arms crossed over his broad chest. And we're not gunfighters. You don't have to be, Finn said. His voice had a new edge to it, a quiet authority that commanded their attention. The haunted look was gone, replaced by the sharp focus of a man with a purpose. He wasn't just planning a defense, he was mapping out a battlefield. Corcoran thinks this is the same town it was 2 days ago. He thinks you're all sheep. We'll show him otherwise. He began to give orders, his words precise and logical. He had them barricade the side alleys, leaving only the main street open. He had them place wagons at key intersections, creating choke points. He wasn't telling them to fight like lawmen, he was telling them to use what they knew. The stable owner knew how to create a panic among horses. The mercantile owner knew which of his supplies could be used to create diversions. Samuel's forge could provide heavy iron to block doorways. It was a plan built on community strength, not individual heroics. Lena watched him, her heart a mixture of pride and fear. This was the man she had glimpsed all along, the leader hidden beneath the drifter's rags. He moved with a confidence that came from deep knowledge, from a life spent understanding violence in order to contain it. Before the meeting broke up, Finn took Sheriff Miller aside. He handed him the tarnished badge. I don't have the right to wear this. Miller looked at the badge, then back at Finn. The right isn't given, son. It's earned. Looks to me like you're earning it back right now. He pushed the badge back into Finn's hand. You hold on to it. For when this is over. As the men dispersed to their tasks, Finn went to the stable. The pre-dawn darkness was giving way to a bruised, grey light. Bastian was waiting for him, his massive head hanging over the stall door. Finn leaned his forehead against the horses, the familiar scent of horsehide and hay a comfort. He spoke to him in a low murmur, the way he had that first day. He wasn't giving commands. He was sharing his burden. He was telling the only other survivor of that canyon what was about to happen. Bastian nickered softly, nudging Finn's shoulder with his nose. It was a gesture of absolute trust, of unwavering partnership. This horse had seen him at his lowest, had followed him in his flight from shame. Now, he would stand with him as he faced it. Finn saddled the great horse, the worn leather creaking in the quiet stable. The movements were practiced, automatic. But this time, it felt different. He wasn't saddling a horse to run. He was preparing for a reckoning. As he cinched the final strap, he slipped the marshal's badge into his coat pocket. It felt heavy. Not with shame, but with purpose. He and Bastian were ready. The first clap of thunder echoed from the mountains. The storm was coming. The rain began as a whisper, then grew to a roar, turning the dusty street into a river of mud. The sky went black. Thunder cracked overhead, shaking the very foundations of the town. As Finn had predicted, this was the moment Corcoran chose to strike. The front window of the Redemption Gap bank shattered, the sound swallowed by the storm. Two of Corcoran's men emerged, dragging the bank manager and a young teller out with them, using them as human shields. The other three, including Corcoran himself, remained inside, securing the money. They were professionals. There was no wasted motion, no panicked shouting. They moved with chilling precision. "We have the bank." Corcoran's voice boomed from within, easily carrying over the deluge. "We will be leaving shortly. Anyone who tries to stop us, these two men die." Then we start on the rest of the town. From his vantage point in the livery, Finn watched. He saw the fear on the faces of the hostages. He felt the old, familiar weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. But this time, it wasn't paralyzing. It was clarifying. He looked at Sheriff Miller, who was positioned across the street. Miller gave a slow, deliberate nod. The plan was in motion. Samuel, from the smithy, heaved a massive, red-hot piece of iron he'd been heating in the forge onto the street. It hissed and steamed violently in the rain, a glowing barrier of intense heat that blocked the gang's most direct escape route. At the same moment, from the far end of the street, the stable owner released a small herd of spooked horses, their panicked whinnies adding to the chaos. They galloped through the mud, a living, unpredictable obstacle. Corcoran's men were momentarily thrown, their perfect plan disrupted by the coordinated resistance of simple townsfolk. This wasn't the sleepy, defenseless town they had scouted. Corcoran appeared in the doorway of the bank, his face a mask of cold fury. He saw the barricades, the hot iron, the stampeding horses. And he saw Finn, stepping out of the livery into the storm. Then he saw the horse beside him. Bastian stood like a rock in the downpour, his black coat gleaming, utterly unfazed by the thunder and the chaos. He was a war horse, and this was his battlefield. "So, the dead marshal walks," Corcoran sneered, raising his pistol. "I should have left you buried in those rocks with your friend." The name, Marcus, hung in the air between them. It was the wound Corcoran intended to tear open one last time. Finn didn't flinch. He swung himself up onto Bastian's bare back. "This ends today, Corcoran," he urged Bastian forward, not into a charge, but a steady, inexorable walk. The sheer size of the horse was a weapon in itself. He was a moving wall of muscle and bone. The two men holding the hostages hesitated, their eyes wide at the sight of the approaching giant. This was not in their calculations. Finn didn't draw a weapon. He just kept coming, his focus entirely on Corcoran. This was between them. The town had given him his chance, had created the opening. Now he had to finish it. The rain plastered his hair to his face. The thunder was a drumbeat for the final confrontation. Man and horse, moving as one, advanced through the storm to meet the ghost that had haunted them for 2 long years. The 2 gunmen holding the hostages were the first to break. The sight of Bastien advancing through the storm, a creature of myth and nightmare, was too much for their professional composure. One of them fired a wild shot. The bullet whizzed past Finn's head, but Bastien didn't even flinch. He had been trained for the sounds of battle, and a single pistol shot was nothing. Finn urged him on, and the horse lowered his head, picking up speed, his hooves churning the mud into thick spray. The gunmen scattered, shoving the hostages to the ground and diving for cover. They had signed up to fight men, not an avalanche on full legs. Now it was just Finn and Corcoran. Corcoran was different. He held his ground, his eyes locked on Finn, a cold smile on his face. He respected power, and he saw it before him. He raised his pistol and fired, not at Finn, but at the ground just in front of Bastien. The horse reared, a scream of fury tearing from his throat, his front hooves slashing at the rain-soaked air. It was a terrifying sight, but Finn moved with him, a part of the animal's motion. As Bastien came down, Finn launched himself from the horse's back, tackling Corcoran and sending them both sliding into the thick mud in front of the bank. The fight was no longer about guns. It was primal, a brutal struggle of fists and desperation. Corcoran was wiry and strong, a snake of a man, but Finn was fueled by 2 years of suppressed rage and shame. He fought not just for the town, but for his own soul, for the memory of his fallen partner. Every blow he landed was a rejection of the coward he believed himself to be. As they wrestled in the mud, Bastien became a guardian. When one of Corcoran's men tried to intervene, the great horse spun, his back hooves lashing out with incredible speed and force, sending the man flying into a water trough with a crack of breaking bone. He stood over the fight, a black titan, ensuring it remained a duel between 2 men. The rest of Corcoran's gang, seeing their leader engaged and their escape routes blocked by a town that had suddenly grown teeth, lost their nerve. Led by Sheriff Miller and Samuel, the townsfolk emerged, their faces grim and determined. The outlaws threw down their weapons, their professional veneer washed away by the mud and the unexpected ferocity of their opposition. The fight between Finn and Corcoran ended when Finn, his face bruised and bleeding, finally pinned Corcoran's gun hand to the ground. He held his fist high, ready to deliver the final blow. Corcoran looked up at him, spitting a mouthful of mud and blood. "Go on, Marshal," he hissed. "Finish it. Be the killer I always knew you were." Finn froze. He looked at his fist, then at the man beneath him. Killing him would be easy. It would be vengeance. But it would also be a surrender to the darkness that had haunted him. He remembered Lena's words, Corcoran killed him. He remembered Marcus's face, not as he died, but as he lived, laughing, full of life. He slowly lowered his fist. He would not become the monster he was fighting. He pulled Corcoran to his feet and slammed him against the bank wall, his forearm pressed against the man's throat. "It's over," Finn said, his voice ragged but clear. He had not won by killing. He had won by choosing not to. He had defeated Corcoran, but more importantly, he had defeated the ghost inside himself. As Sheriff Miller came forward to put the irons on Corcoran, Finn reached into his coat. He pulled out the tarnished badge and pressed it into Miller's hand. His yaws. The rain began to soften, the thunder receding into the mountains. The storm had broken. Finn stood, mud-caked and exhausted, and looked at his town. They were looking back at him, their faces filled with a gratitude that went beyond words. He had faced his past, and in doing so, he had given them back their future. In the days that followed, Redemption Gap slowly returned to itself, but it was a changed town. The quiet respect they held for Finn had solidified into something permanent, something akin to reverence. The remaining members of Corcoran's gang were locked in the town jail, awaiting transfer to a federal prison. Corcoran himself, sullen and silent, was under constant guard. The broken bank window was repaired, the spilled lumber was restacked, and the street was cleared of mud and debris. Life went on, but with a new sense of security, a new pride. A week after the storm, a federal agent rode into town. He was a stern man in a crisp suit, his demeanor a stark contrast to the frontier setting. He had been tracking Corcoran for months and was stunned to find him already captured. He met with Sheriff Miller and Finn in the sheriff's office. The agent laid a file on the desk. "Finian Holloway," he said, reading the name from the file. It sounded foreign, a name from another life. Disgraced Marshal. Resigned commission 2 years ago after the incident at Black Hills Canyon. "You've been a hard man to find." Finn said nothing. He just stood by the window, looking out at the street. "Corcoran has been talking," the agent continued. "He confessed to setting the rock slide. New evidence corroborates his story. Your partner, Marcus Rell, is being posthumously awarded for his bravery. And your name, Marshal Holloway, has been officially cleared of all fault." The agent slid a document across the desk. It was an official reinstatement of his commission. "The service wants you back. There's a place for you in Denver." Finn looked at the document, at the official seal and the flowing signature. It was everything he thought he wanted. Vindication. A return to his old life. He looked out the window again, his gaze landing on the smithy. He saw Lena at the doorway, her silhouette framed by the forge glow. He saw Bastien in the nearby corral, standing peacefully in the afternoon sun. He saw Samuel hammering a new horseshoe, the rhythm of it the steady heartbeat of the town. This was his life now. "Thank you, sir," Finn said, turning from the window. "But I believe I already have a job." He looked at Sheriff Miller, who was trying and failing to hide a proud smile. Later that day, the town council held a meeting. They formally offered Finn the position of town sheriff. Miller was retiring, and he had made it clear there was only one man for the job. Finn accepted. He didn't do it with a grand speech. He just nodded and said, "I'll do my best to protect this town." The tarnished badge was polished until it shone. When he pinned it to his chest, it no longer felt like a burden. It felt like a promise. His professional life was restored, not by returning to the past, but by embracing the present. His communal belonging was sealed. That evening, he found Lena by the creek, skipping stones across the smooth water. They stood in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sunset paint the sky. "So, you're staying," she said, not as a question, but as a statement of a truth she had known all along. "I'm staying," he confirmed. He reached out and took her hand. Her fingers laced with his, a perfect fit. It wasn't a dramatic declaration of love, but a quiet, solid understanding. A partnership forged in crisis and tempered in peace. His romantic resolution was as understated and as strong as the man himself. Finally, a few days later, Finn stood with Samuel at the forge. He was learning to work the iron, his skilled hands taking to the new craft with surprising ease. He was heating a long iron rod in the glowing coals. On the anvil lay a design he had sketched out, a simple shield, like the brand on Bastien's flank, but with a silhouette of a mountain peak inside it instead of a line. It was to be the new brand for Redemption Gap, a symbol of its strength and the man who had helped them find it. He pulled the glowing iron from the fire, the amber light illuminating his face. He was no longer Finian Holloway, the disgraced marshal. He wasn't just Finn, the drifter. He was Sheriff Holloway of Redemption Gap. A protector. A part of something. He brought the hammer down on the hot iron, and the sound rang out, clear and true. It was the sound of a man forging a new life, a sound of earned resolution, a sound of a man who was finally, truly, home.